Erik Larson, award-winning, best-selling author, the author of his newest book, Demon of Unrest. It's the latest in a string of books. Erik, I have to tell you that I discovered you through Devil in the White City, like many others, as someone who was born and raised in Chicago. We Chicagoans love Chicago, but we don't learn that much about the incredible history of that city, and it was an incredibly revealing book.
Thank you. No, that book has just kept keeping on. I mean, it came out incredibly, hard to believe this, back in 2003. So it's now 20 years old.
One of the compelling parts of that is the way that you weave the narratives together. And I just wanted to begin there, because you're telling the story of the World's Fair, and you're also telling the story of the serial killer. And, to many, when you focus on a biography or history book, you're really diving into one narrative, but you find these multiple characters, and I'd love to hear the origin story of how you came about that book.
You sure you want to hear the origin story? It's actually a very long story in which serendipity played a key role, but I'll just keep it short. Basically, what it comes down to is that I had set out, actually in 1994, I'd read a book called The Alienist by Caleb Carr, who alas died just this past May. A fabulous novel about a serial killer in old New York. And after reading that, I had this real powerful sense that I might have actually lived briefly in old New York. So I started thinking, maybe I could do a book about, a nonfiction book about a real life historical murder. Started looking for one. Was living in Seattle at the time, went to the Suzzallo Library at the University of Washington, took out a book called The Encyclopedia of Murder. Started reading at A. Can't tell you where I came across Holmes. Might have been H, might have been M. Holmes being, of course, the murderer in Devil in the White City. But when I did come across him, I was not interested. I didn't want to write crime porn. I didn't. Here's this guy with dissection tables and acid vats and so forth, and I was more interested in trying to find a story that might be something like the old film Gosford Park, if you had a chance to ever see that. So I kept looking. I got sidetracked by a headline in a newspaper about the hurricane that destroyed Galveston in 1900. Totally sidetracked, did that book, came back to the idea.
So sidetracked that for several years, because you wrote a different
Sidetracked
book.
for several years. That became my book, Isaac's Store. Once again, after that, I was in what my publicist calls the dark country of no ideas. I was still thinking about a murder, still looking, but it just was not panning out. Nothing was working in that respect. But I did remember that reading about Holmes, I had come across reference to the World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago. I knew nothing about it, but it was clear from the reference that I read that this had been a very big deal. Nothing on my plate. I thought, okay, I'll read about the World's Fair. The first book I got again from that library should have killed the idea dead right then. It's the most boring book. It was a sort of a deconstructionist, Marxist deconstructionist analysis of one pavilion at the World's Fair. But I know from experience to look at the footnotes. Went to the footnotes, and right away I was just absolutely entranced. The first footnote I came across said that juicy fruit gum was introduced to consumers at the World's Fair of 1893. Now, that's my favorite gum. I had no idea that gum was 100 years old, and I read through the rest of these footnotes and learned that Cracker Jack was introduced to consumers. The zipper was a failure then. It only became a successful product in 1913. But the vertical file was introduced at the fair. And suddenly it occurred to me, wait a minute, that's the story. I mean, here's this killer operating literally 8 blocks away. And here's this World's Fair, this consummate act of civic goodwill, literally nicknamed the White City. And I knew right away that this was going to be my title, The Devil in the White City. And that's how that book got started. Now, less well known is the fact that on the eve of publication of that book, I was convinced, and my wife will confirm this, I was convinced that my career was over.
Why?
Because here's a story with two narratives running side by side that only touch in one small part. I was convinced that I was going to be, torn to shreds by the reviewers of America. Happily, I was wrong.
Yeah, America and the world thought
Yeah,
otherwise.
yeah.
To your incredible success, Erik. When people see your name on a book jacket, I think it's an automatic buy for many of us. As a journalist, I was curious. You began your origins as a reporter, writing for local news, and then writing for the Wall Street Journal, and then you made the transition to writing books.
How did I do that?
What? Yeah, how does that come about?
It was actually a pretty natural progression. I started, as you noted, in local news, small newspaper in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. But I had the great fortune at that newspaper to be assigned to the Sunday newspaper, which at the time had 125,000 circulation, which was substantial for a small, suburban newspaper. And my job was, manyfold, but my key responsibility was to write the so-called Sunday special. I alternate with a couple other writers on the Sunday paper. Sunday special was a full-page feature story. You never get to do that as a young reporter. And so that really taught me a lot about storytelling, maintaining interest for a long story. And those are the things actually that got me the job, my next job, which was at the Wall Street Journal out of the Philadelphia Bureau, which no longer exists. But those long stories got me the attention I needed to make that jump to the Wall Street Journal. There, I polished other skills. Back in the day, at the Wall Street Journal back in the 80s when I was there, I specialized in these front page funny stories called A-heads down what used to be, they used to run down the center of the front page.
Right. The Wall Street Journal would have a bunch of the major headlines and then like a deeper dive into something you would never expect. A deeper dive.
In fact, the rule of thumb was the more insignificant, the better. But back in that era when I was working there, I could spend an entire month to produce a that is to say, 4 double-spaced page story, and so it gave me the opportunity to go really deep into the history, really deep down rabbit holes that ordinarily a reporter would not be allowed to go down, and dredge up these little details and facts. And that's what sort of stuck with me from that experience. I made a devil's bargain with my wife. We were, by this time, had transferred with the Journal to San Francisco. She's a physician. She got a great job at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. I said, okay, I'll go with you to Baltimore, leave my beloved San Francisco behind, provided I don't have to earn income for a whole year. So she accepted that. I couldn't not write, so I did a bunch of freelance stuff. And I found that we were writing these long pieces, like for the Atlantic, for Harper's, and so forth. I might as well be writing a book. The amount of reporting that I had to do, the notes that I took. So one day, I just did a proposal for a book, my very first book, The Naked Consumer, a book that nobody bought, nobody read. One guy reviewed. He hated it because he was the target of the book. It was a book about how companies spy on individual consumers. I thought it was a fabulous book. Sold nothing, but I got the bug. And I realized, this is perfectly suited to my personality and to that point in my life.
And then you were addicted. That was it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I loved the lifestyle. I loved the pace. I could have used a lot more money, and in fact, briefly went back into mainstream journalism. Joined Time Magazine for an innovative experiment that they were doing in which writers would do an entire story by themselves, which of course was not how Time operated. Didn't really work out for anyone. I found myself back on the boards writing books. Did my next book, Lethal Passage, about America's gun culture. Did critically hugely acclaimed. Again, not so tremendous on the sales front, but good. And from there on, I just kept advancing.
So you've said you take 4 years to research a book.
Well, 4 years to research and write
a book. And so, you've done turn of the century Galveston, you've done World War II, both in Germany and the UK, the Chicago World's Fair, now the American Civil War. Does it begin, like it sounds like Devil in the White City began with this idea of a murder? Does it typically begin with one idea, or has it been different for all the various books that you've been written?
It's been different for every book. There's no typical way that an idea arises. I mean, look, I wish I had a 3D printer, that could just spit out ideas for me. But almost every idea that I've had has had some element of luck involved, as I indicated with The Devil in the White City. It's almost impossible to talk about any one idea as a model for how these things come about.
And when you take on a topic in your newest book, like the Civil War, where there's been, I don't even know what the estimate is, tens of thousands of books written about.
I can tell you, actually, according to, I did this just the other day. According to Siri, there are 66,000 books about the Civil War.
Overwhelming.
Now you may ask me.
Yes.
You may ask me, what did I think I could add to the party?
Yeah. Like, where did you think you could bring a unique angle?
Well, so I mean, as you may or might not know, I was on record as having said numerous times over the prior decade that I would never write about the Civil War, and definitely never write about Abraham Lincoln in any way, simply because too much had been done. There were too many armchair experts to make your life miserable. But then came this uncalculable event, the pandemic. I was in the middle of my book tour for my book about Churchill, the Splendid and the Vile, when the world shut down. Flew home on my wife's birthday and found myself suddenly with a lot more time on my hands than I had expected to have. I thought, okay, I'm going to use this lockdown period productively. Lockdown is what I do best, after all. I started looking into other potential ideas. But around back then, as now, I'm sure you recall, there was a lot of political discord. A lot of people muttering, fringe people, and some not so fringe, if you include the state of Texas, but a lot of fringe people muttering about Civil War and secession and so forth. And I found myself idly wondering, well, okay, how did the American Civil War actually start? Yeah, I knew the high school timeline, Fort Sumter, the whole deal, but what was the real story? And that actually is often how my book ideas begin to materialize. A question comes to me: what was that like? Like with the Churchill book, what would that have been like to have been living in London in that first year of the active part of World War II? The first year of the German air campaign, to be living in London, if you were Churchill and his family. That was the question. What would that be like? And that was inspired directly by our move to Manhattan, where I realized in an instant that the visceral experience of New Yorkers to 9/11 was so different than what I'd experienced in Seattle, even though, we watched the whole thing unfold in real time and so forth. But it was so different, viscerally different. How then did Winston Churchill and his family endure, at the peak of that German air campaign, 52 consecutive nights of bombing, 52, if you will, consecutive 9/11s. And that's what powered that idea. In this case, it was, how did that really start? And so I started looking around. Ordinarily, when I have a question like that, I will jump into a physical archive. Without any advanced planning, without contacting any curators. I like to work under the radar and just see what was available. I couldn't, of course, because the pandemic, the major archives that I needed were closed. And even had they not been, there's no way I was going to fly to them or take a train. So I was forced to do online research. I don't like online research. It's stultifying. It's like, and also there's too much material. It makes you feel as though every idea has been overdone. It's like, it's the proverbial, sucking on a fire hydrant, but I had no choice but to do some online poking around. And I came across a collection of documents called The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. Started reading this. I read enough to know that this was really interesting stuff. I was really, really captivated by this. So much so that I managed to find and order a hard copy of Volume 1 of this record set, Volume 1 being the start of the Civil War. There are in that record set, by the way, 128 volumes. I just ordered the first. Got it to my pandemic readout out on Eastern Long Island. The book arrives. Of course, I spray it. It was disinfectant. I mean, literally sprayed it with disinfectant.
That's when we were Lysoling the vegetables, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And we use Clorox.
There we go.
So this collection arrives. I continue to read it, and I was enthralled. I mean, this book contains hundreds of documents, scrupulously curated in chronological order. Letter, response, telegram, response, report, response, and so forth, tracking this inexorable drive towards civil war. I mean, you read this book, and you just want to scream at these people, "Stop! Do you not see where this is going?" Of course, nobody did. Actually, really, nobody in that era had any conception of what civil war would really mean. But anyway, that's how it got started. But I still was not committed. It takes a while for me to really pull the trigger and dig in on a project. There were other things that were sort of flirting outside the corner of my vision. But then came the events of January 6, 2021. And it was amazing to me. As I watched that unfold from my desk here in Manhattan on my computer, as I watched that, I felt appalled, riveted, anxious. But I also found myself caught up in the whole suspense of this thing. But I realized what I was seeing, the documents that I had been reading from 1860-61 could have been written today. The two moments of gravest national concern in 1861, prior to the start of the Civil War. The two moments of gravest concern were the electoral count of the presidential vote and the inauguration. Would both of these things come off without interruption? And doesn't that sound familiar?
Little did we know, 180 years later, we have the same dilemma going on.
I know.
Your book here focuses, for those of us growing up, learning about the Civil War, the Civil War starts, and then we say the war, and then there's Gettysburg, and there's the Emancipation Proclamation, and you really focus in on here Lincoln's election in November of 1860 and the 5 months until the war starts. This sort of post-election period, which used to be much longer before the 20th century. Inauguration Day wasn't until March. And so you have an Abraham Lincoln who's elected here and is unable to do anything because he's just president-elect as the country comes apart.
Well, it's even worse than that. Worse is probably the wrong word. But he is president-elect. He is also, though, enough of a respecter of the Constitution to recognize the fact that he is not actually yet president. That will become the case when the electoral vote is certified, and will really become the case on March 4th, 1861, when he is inaugurated. So, but he chose, because of the complex national crisis, he chose to be silent during that period, mostly silent. So you have this interesting situation where, yes, he's president, but he's not weighing in on the widening division between North and
He's
South.
Respecting the fact that there's one president at a time, and he's going to sit back.
Right. And unfortunately, the one president at the time was James Buchanan, who much to everybody's surprise, because he was a stellar politician before becoming president, was absolutely inept and passive and did nothing. There was a vacuum in Washington. Worse than a vacuum, he was very much sympathetic to the South. His members of his cabinet, one by one, fled to the South eventually. So you had this situation where the secessionists were clamoring to pull South Carolina out of the Union, and nobody was saying boo to stop them.
Yeah, so you have Lincoln elected in November, South Carolina secedes in December. In February, 6 more states follow, Mississippi and several others. The Confederate States are established in February. This is all after Lincoln's elected, but before he can take office. And you have James Buchanan in here, and what's his goal? He's the president watching his country come apart. What's going through his mind during this time?
Well, his goal, frankly, was to do everything he could to get out of office without a war starting during his tenure. He wanted, beyond anything else, to get to his country estate outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and just have a peaceful retirement from there on. Wasn't going to happen. Interestingly, as things degraded, Buchanan actually gave a speech to Congress, a very important speech. I think it was the second to last speech he gave, in which he pretty much gave up, pretty much threw in the towel. He said, there is nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. It is up to Congress to resolve this problem. Now, we know how effective Congress can be.
In 2024 or 1860, yeah.
Both, So anyway, that was the setup for obviously what became this greatest of American tragedies.
So going back to Lincoln here in his election, there was this great fear in the South that you write about what he would do to the South. At the same time, despite what many of us learned today, when you go into details here about where Abraham Lincoln stood on the South and on slavery, he was effectively saying there's nothing to fear here. I'm going to respect the slave states that already exist.
Yes, in those opportunities where he was able to express his views, he was very clear that he had no plans to interfere with slavery in those states where it already existed. He went so far as to say also that he would honor and enforce the so-called Fugitive Slave Act, which was reviled by abolitionists and anti-slavery folk in the North because it was a law passed in 1850 that allowed Southern planters to go north to retrieve their escaped slaves with impunity, and even to get federal help to do so. So Lincoln vowed actually to support that much hated act. The South, we talk today about echo chambers and so forth because of the internet. The South, back in this era, was convinced beyond doubt that Lincoln actually was an abolitionist at heart, and that once he became president, he would abolish slavery immediately, which, of course, to Southerners would be an existential catastrophe. Because the South, the economy of the South, was based entirely on the labor of enslaved people. So 4 million, I believe, is the number of the enslaved. What I think people often forget is that apart from simply being a source of labor, slaves were capital. They had value, dollar value. You could take out a mortgage secured by your holdings of slaves. To abolish slavery would not be just to remove this free labor from the equation, but also be to wipe out the capital of these planters who had come to live this very cushy life, on the backs of their enslaved capital.
When you speak to people who are either raised in the North or raised in the South, you get very different impressions about how you grow up learning about the origins of the Civil War. Growing up as
Right.
north of the Mason-Dixon line in Chicago, slavery was a key part of it. Meeting people in college, it's like, well, no, it's a story about it's a story about states' rights and the aggression of the
Right.
North and that storyline. You have now delved into this the 5 months preceding the war comprehensively without having to do a whole Ken Burns documentary here. What
Right.
were the core issues here that lead to secession?
Well, the core issue was in fact slavery. States' rights was sort of a I don't want to call it a ploy, but back around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, there was a school of scholarship that tried to paint the start of the war as being simply a question of states' rights. Anybody who reads into the material in depth, as I did, sees immediately it was all about slavery, and Southerners, the Southern secessionists, and so forth. they made no effort to hide that fact. Mississippi, in its secession ordinance, made it very clear that slavery, the fear that slavery would be abolished, was central to its concern, central to its interest in seceding from the Union. So, and it's just, even now, though, like you, I hear people saying, "Oh, yeah, the War of Northern Aggression."
Well, it came up on the campaign trail. Nikki Haley was struggling with the question, the former South Carolina governor.
I know. The War of Northern Aggression, or some now also like to refer to it as Lincoln's War. It was him, he alone, who caused the Civil War. Anyway.
When we talk about the Civil War, when we talk about slavery, I want to zoom out for a second and talk about where America stood in 1860 versus the rest of the world when it comes to owning other human beings. Slavery. How unique was America and the American South at that point in history?
Well, that's a really a crucial part of the whole saga. Around the start of the 19th century, even planters would have said, in late 18th century, even planters would have said that slavery was a necessary evil. But what happened at the start of the 19th century, the world made a tectonic shift away from slavery, led by Britain, which was quick to abolish the slave trade.
What's the wake-up call they have over there? What shifts?
What's the wake-up call? I've read a couple of accounts of how that happened, and a lot seems to have been based on the strong personalities of a couple of really potent reformers, and also coinciding with some major slave atrocities involving the international trade. But the upshot is that Britain moved decisively away from slavery. Even the United States banned the international slave trade early on. Smuggling continued, and the U.S. made a distinction and allowed the domestic slave trade to continue, which is very interesting because suddenly slaves became even more valuable because the supply was in theory at least limited. There was a lot of smuggling as well then. So the world was moving away from slavery decisively. The North was moving away from slavery decisively. The abolitionists were on the rise. The abolitionist newspapers were churning out attacks on slavery and mailing bulk mailings of these tracts and newspapers to Southern post offices. And the South, meanwhile, was retrenching and came up with a very interesting argument. So-called pro-slavery movement arose through which Southerners persuaded themselves. They weren't necessarily trying to persuade anybody else because they knew they couldn't, but persuaded themselves that slavery really was the best of all possible worlds for blacks, for enslaved blacks, because they were built for this kind of labor, and they were being provided with all their meals, all their clothing, housing, without being subject to economic changes. Unlike in the North, where the wage slaves, could be thrown out of work in a heartbeat. If they got sick, they would be cast aside. So Southerners made this argument that slavery was actually the best of all things. They used religion to quote unquote prove it. They used anthropology, and they did a pretty good job of persuading themselves that slavery was a good thing. So just to tie that together. So you have not just our North and South flying apart. You've got the world, the advanced world, let's say, utterly rejecting slavery. You've got the South doubling down and saying, we're not going to reject it. This is the best of all things. And there also is the fuel for the Civil War.
So then the fear becomes so acute in South Carolina in particular, that Abraham Lincoln is going to end slavery upon becoming president. They can't wait. They cannot wait for him to be inaugurated.
Right. So the secession movement, but it's important to understand also that South Carolina was always what the argot of the time you would call South Carolina tetchy, always a tetchy state. In 1830s, it was it sought to nullify the action of federal laws in the state of South Carolina, so-called nullification movement. Happily, the president at the time, Jackson, was like, no, you're not going to do that. Was very forcefully quashed that whole thing. But South Carolina continued to see itself as an aggrieved state, suppressed and oppressed by the North. One thing leads to another. The secession movement gains momentum, and then comes this vacuum that reverberates with fear and misinformation. The secession ordinance is passed, and South Carolina becomes infuriated with the fact that here in Charleston Harbor there is still this federal presence. The United States Army controlled a number of forts, one of which was Fort Sumter, and they could not stand that fact. They demanded that situation end. Lincoln was not willing to let that situation end.
So I'm curious, Buchanan, the previous president, why, if he's trying to avoid war, he was still resolute on maintaining federal presence there and not just appeasing the South Carolinians and saying, you know what, we're going to abandon the fort?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have no idea. I'm glad. Easy to say. But suffice it to say that he understood that if he gave up these federal properties in Charleston Harbor, that was not necessarily the situation that was going to get him out scot-free. He was looking for the easiest path to have nothing happen, to have no war happen during his tenure. What's the sort of more interesting question is and I don't engage in speculative history. I think it's a fool's game. But an interesting question does arise when you read about this era: is what if Buchanan had been a strong president? What if he had been a strong and utterly patriotic president? Now, I don't want to say he was not patriotic. It's simply that he did favor the South. He did look upon the South with a lot more approval than anybody else probably would have from the North. So what would have happened if he had been a strong president? What would have happened if he, as soon as the secession movement began steaming along, what if he just said, no? At that point, Charleston Harbor was pretty much undefended apart from the federal forts in the harbor. There hadn't been, General Beauregard hadn't yet had a chance to install all of his gun batteries on promontories around the fort. What would have happened if Buchanan had simply sailed what was left of the U.S. Navy? Was not that big. We have to concede that. But what would happen if he had sailed the best warships of the U.S. Navy into Charleston Harbor and said, "Okay, you're done. No more secession." Now, would that have put an end to everything? Probably.
Right. It gets to the question of the inevitability of history, or the yes. role of the individual in history.
Yeah, very much.
And
that's why I say the speculative history is a fool's errand. So many threads, so many little things. You pull one thread, then it's what about this? What would have happened then?
Yeah, and you try to, we're talking about big shifts here, societal shifts, slavery, states, etc. You try to tell the story through various individuals. And it's interesting, as I read up some of the characters, like Edmund Ruffin, I'm trying to compare them to certain individuals today who might be have certain media outlets. They might be named Alex Jones, etc., who are
You said that.
I said that, you didn't. But rabble rousers, people, the role of the individual and individuals in shaping our history.
This is something that was very important to me as I got into the research for this book. I'm really interested in the human factors of history. The role of personality. You mentioned Edmund Ruffin, who is one of two fabulous villains in the book. Edmund Ruffin lived for self-affirmation. For to win the approval of others. He just could not get enough applause from people. He felt like they just were not appreciating him or his role in helping South Carolina achieve its independent destiny. His diary, his 4,000-page diary, is full of sort of this sort of sense of himself being neglected by everyone around him until finally secession happened. And then he takes on a very interesting role, which I don't want to talk about because it's kind of a surprise.
But interestingly, as you know, as somebody who took various history courses, read history, I knew nothing about Edmund Ruffin, and it's so incredible to learn about these individuals and the role they played, particularly his role when it comes to cultivating this idea of it's time to create our own country here.
Right, and typically Civil War historiography leaves Edmund Ruffin out, leaves also the second villain, Senator James Henry Hammond, out, except in sort of peripheral ways, perhaps bringing them in for a comment here or a comment there. But what I realized is, as a former journalist, I realized that these guys were fabulous characters. They were, you could not. The best of all things when you're writing about history is you could not make this up. You could not make these characters up. But what I realized is that, both those guys served a strategic narrative purpose. One problem with the Civil War, one of the reasons I vowed never to ever write about it, was that you need to know an awful lot of backstory before you can get to the start of the Civil War. And there are two ways to go about that. One is to write in an expository, monographic fashion, just detailing what happened. Problem there is you kill your audience before you get to the action in the book. Another approach is to use these characters, these very vivid characters who lived the backstory, and use them to tell the backstory, to tell about how shocking it was when Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared on the scene, how shocking it was when John Brown and his men seized the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. You see all these things happening through the lives of people to whom these things mattered intensely. And then you come up to the election, and then you can just zoom along.
So we're in South Carolina. The federal military has moved its presence, is now over at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter becomes this sort of catalyst, or that really sets off the war. Tell us about Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, and why that becomes the place that really sets off the war in April.
Right. So as I mentioned, this federal presence in the harbor became a symbol of all the tyranny and so forth that South Carolina had claimed existed all along. And this aggrieved view became even more pronounced after the secession ordinance. So what happens is then, before Lincoln is elected, just before he's elected, a new commander is assigned to the federal fortifications in Charleston Harbor, a man named Major Robert Anderson. The fortifications that existed then in the harbor, one was Fort Sumter, which was incomplete. Guns hadn't been mounted. It was built to house 650 men, but had nothing like that. Just a handful of men. The guns were lying around on the parade ground inside, and it was incomplete. Construction had begun in 1828, but it was still not done. So there was Fort Sumter, a classic sea fortress, which had it been fully armed, would actually have been pretty much impregnable. But there was also Fort Moultrie, which was on Sullivan's Island, and that was a fully operating fort, but also built for the same reason that Sumter was, as a defense against foreign attack, because Spain, England, and France were still considered the primary likely enemies. So you have those two fortresses. You have a couple of smaller fortresses. You have a federal arsenal. Anderson is put in charge of all of these things. Interestingly, Anderson is a Southerner by birth. He is a former slave owner himself. His wife is from Georgia, and a daughter of a prominent a Georgian general, military man. Speculation was that Buchanan's secretary chief of the War Department, put Anderson in this job because he was a Southern sympathizer, with the idea that possibly he might be more willing to turn over the fortifications in the harbor than somebody else. Misreading completely of Major Robert Anderson. Anderson was loyal to a fault, one could say, not so much to the United States, but to the United States Army. He had made a vow, an oath of loyalty to the Army, and by God, he was going to stick with it. So things degrade. He realizes that his situation at Fort Moultrie is not tenable, because Fort Moultrie was built, like I said, to defend against foreign attack. It was not built to defend against attack from behind by fellow Americans. So Anderson realizes he's a military, he's an artillery expert. He taught at West Point. He taught artillery tactics at West Point. He knows that this is not tenable. He cooks up a plan to move his men secretly to Fort Sumter, to occupy Fort Sumter, to bring his 75 men and their families secretly from Fort Moultrie over to Fort Sumter on the night after Christmas, and he pulls it off. It's a brilliant, secret move.
South Carolina has already seceded from the Union. South Carolina is an independent state at this point.
Yes, they're already an independent state, and one reason he feels he wants to move is because of that, the hostility around him, he feels it intensifying radically. So he makes this move. The first indication that Charlestonians have that this has happened is that the next morning, flames and smoke are pouring from Fort Moultrie, where Anderson, he had left a couple of officers and men behind, to set fire to the gun carriages in Fort Moultrie and to spike the guns so that they were unusable. So the Charlestonians awake to find smoke pouring from this fort, and to see this giant American flag now suddenly flying from Fort Sumter. They're infuriated. They demand that Anderson release the fort to them. They immediately seize Fort Moultrie and the other fortifications in the harbor, and so the standoff begins. Anderson is in the fort. He and his men, a group of engineers with the Army Corps of Engineers, some enlisted men, Anderson and his officers, their families, and they immediately start placing the guns in their appropriate emplacements in the walls of Fort Sumter to make this thing, to bring it up to a position where it really could withstand attack from Southern forces. And he does a great job of this, the best he can possibly do, considering that he's got 75 men and the fortress was designed for 650. And the standoff there continues, worsens, and as you noted, Southern forces come to the point where they realize we've got to do something now, because once Lincoln's elected, once Lincoln is actually president, and starts to maneuver as president, it's going to all be over.
You talk about an anecdote from Lincoln upon getting elected. Apparently, he's heard saying, "God help me." This is already in November. This is pre-secession. What from your research do you get the sense that Abraham Lincoln expected his presidency would entail on Election Day 1860, and then of course he's inaugurated and has a war on his hands within a month? What
did he expect? Well, I think that Lincoln had a limited appreciation of the true nature of Southern aggrievement. He like many Northerners, he couldn't really understand it. He didn't get it. Along the same lines of why were they not listening to him when he said that he had no interest in abolishing slavery? What was that about? So I think he came into it feeling quite not feeling, but quite naive about the true depth of Southern concern and existential fear. He also came in with this rather naive view that with all these patronage jobs that were now available because of the shifting of administrations, that maybe he could handle it all himself. While meanwhile, there are all these national issues that are this pressing national issue that is unfolding. So that was pretty much the way he saw the landscape.
And you talk about the parallels in this sort of post-election period between 2020 and 1860. So there's the election certification of February 13th. So February 13th is their version of January 6th. The army moves into D.C. The vice president of the previous president, Buchanan, had run against Abraham Lincoln. A mob is trying to get into the Capitol. It's striking reading that, having lived through January 6th.
Well, absolutely. Interestingly, though, back in 1861, they handled it differently, markedly differently than we did in 2021. I think to our discredit. Back in 1861, the commanding general of the United States Army was General Winfield Scott, famous veteran of past wars. He was nearing the end of his viable life as a commander. Here's a guy who was about 6'4", 350 pounds. Every imaginable ailment, it seemed. Spent much of his time with his feet in an ice bath. And one Navy officer described visiting him as like visiting a sick bear. But General Winfield Scott was loyal to the United States, and he vowed that by God, these two things are going to happen: the electoral count is going to happen, and the inauguration is going to happen. So prior to the electoral count, he floods the city of Washington with troops, not just troops on foot, but cavalry and artillery units to make the point that this is going to happen. In fact, he vows that if anybody tries to interrupt the electoral count, he will strap that person to the front of a cannon, fire him out the window, and manure the hills of Arlington, Virginia, with his body.
It seems like they were much more prepared in 1861.
Much more prepared. And so the electoral count came off, the inauguration came off, all fine. And then, of course, things degraded again.
Is Lincoln, once he's in office, and he's got a 4 or 5 week period there, what does he attempt to do to try to bring the Union back together, or is the goose cooked at that point based on what had already taken place while he was president-elect?
Well, the goose is pretty much cooked at that point. First of all, the South has no interest in coming back into the Union. They want far from it. They approach. There are 3 commissioners are appointed to go north. They serve sort of as diplomatic emissaries. 3 commissioners are appointed to go north to negotiate with the Lincoln administration, with the War Department, for the release of the surrender of Fort Sumter and for the disposition for the moving of Anderson and his
We're
men
a different country now, and we want you out.
we're a different country, exactly. But they come. Here's the thing: the commissioners come to Washington, just absolutely convinced that they're in the right, and that, of course, the Lincoln government will negotiate. Of course, they will, and they realize very quickly that Lincoln's officials of Lincoln's government have zero interest in negotiating, and make it very clear to these Southern commissioners. The Southern commissioners then go back south. This is another element of the story, by the way, is Southern honor. This is something that was a highly polished trait of Southerners in this era. So suddenly these guys, imbued with this sense of a new world that they've created, and they're just swollen with this sense of personal honor, and they're just utterly rejected by these officials of the Lincoln administration. In another context, there would have been duels left and right, but of course we're talking about now governments opposing each other. And so these guys go back to the South. They're not just rebuffed; they're hurt. They're morally feeling shamed and dishonored, and that further fuels the situation.
It's striking, they go in a matter of months. Everyone's a fellow American, part of the United States of America, and now we have two different countries. And you've read through a lot of the correspondence between the two sides, et cetera. How does that strike people? I mean, is that a shock to the system, or are they comfortable? The Southerners comfortable? Like, no, it's gotten to the point where we do need to be our own country here, or is there difficulty saying this was my neighbor and my countryman as of several months ago?
Yeah, it's place that in the better context for me. What do you mean?
So ultimately, like, for example, you tell the story about General Beauregard, who comes up under Anderson.
He was his pupil.
His pupil.
Yes.
They're fellow Americans. They're fellow citizens of the United States of America as of November of 1860. After December 20th, 1860, they're now citizens of two different states and enemy forces.
Right, exactly.
Psychologically, how did that work for people? Was there a comfort level in the South that, no, it's gotten to the point where we're basically different people now with different values and this is okay? Or was it really challenging for people to, despite all that, despite the different political opinions, to now consider these people members, citizens of a different country?
Well, it depends, of course, on who you're talking about. Clearly, not everyone endorsed the secession, but enough did to get the ordinance of secession passed unanimously in South Carolina and in other states. They felt that this was their right to pull out of a nation that did not have their interests, slavery did not have their interests at heart. Let's look specifically at Anderson and Beauregard, because I think that's a very evocative situation. Here's Anderson, who had Beauregard as a pupil, considered him one of his best pupils. Beauregard is placed in charge of Southern fortifications. These guys are friends. They communicate to each other with these. This is one of the things that charmed me about this collection of records I mentioned early on in our conversation. They communicate to each other in letters and telegrams and so forth, just full of this sort of formal sense of courtliness. And closing letters by saying, I hope that we can meet again under better circumstances. Yours, your friend, blah, 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 blah. So you've got this really gentlemanly series of exchanges, despite the fact that things are continuing to degrade, even up to the last. These two guys were courtly towards each other, respecting each other, their sense of honor and so forth. In fact, one of my favorite moments is when an enslaved boy who they don't know, Anderson doesn't know that this kid is actually a slave. They thought he was a free person, who was an invaluable servant at the fort, is captured by the Southern forces. And this is back and forth about releasing him and so forth, and what his real nature was. And then Beauregard makes a remark about how impolite this boy was, and how that reflected on the experience he had within Fort Sumter. Anderson is, his sense of honor now suddenly is inflamed. He says, basically, what do you mean? You think that we made this boy impolite? We would treat blah, 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 blah. Here, in the midst of this national crisis, they're bickering over this boy and how polite he was.
Yeah, and another anecdote, that they allowed mail delivery. I mean, the only form of communication was mail. And so even though the South Carolinians are like, we want the feds off of Fort Sumter, we will allow you to send your mail to Washington to communicate with the leaders, the powers that be, without interfering with mail. It was sacrosanct.
Right, right. I mean, that's a mark of how the situation was. The mail was allowed to continue really up pretty much to the last. So was food delivery, food purchase in Charleston until it wasn't. And then suddenly, Anderson was in a terrible situation. No food. The mail was, obviously an issue of a different order. But suddenly, he's got no food, and no way to sustain his men.
And that's when Lincoln makes the call to reinforce it, reinforce Fort Sumter to the frustration of the Southerners.
That's when he makes the call to reinforce Sumter. There was also a cataclysmic error that he makes, because there are two expeditions, one underway to reinforce Sumter, one to reinforce a fort off the coast of Florida. There's a storm that interferes, but before that, Lincoln makes the mistake of assigning the same advanced warship to both expeditions without realizing. But suffice it to say, word goes south about the fact that this relief expedition is coming to Sumter. Once again, the fear is they don't listen to what Lincoln is saying. They conclude that this is going to be a military expedition. They step things up, and the bombardment of Fort Sumter begins.
So we live in, we joke, we live in unprecedented times. Every day it feels unprecedented. Even as we speak here, there's been an assassination attempt on a president for the first time in a long time. You transport yourself to these other unprecedented moments in history, whether they be, the bombardment of London, the Galveston hurricane, in this case, the Civil War. What lessons, are there lessons from those various periods of time for managing unprecedented times today? And specifically, when we talk about this idea of civil war, these ideas, this chatter of civil war today, the divide in the country, having spent time in 1860, 1861 America, are there lessons for 2024 America, Erik?
I'll tell you that my takeaway, two things. One is when people start talking crazy, take them seriously. And the other is the inconceivable is always conceivable by someone. That's what I take away from this.
Are there certain ways we can feel more optimistic about where we are today, or worried about where we are today? I mean, do you come away with a certain feeling?
I hesitate to speculate. I'll be confronting people like to talk about Civil War, and I've been listening to all these rants on Twitter from people saying, had that bullet come an inch closer, we were just an inch away from Civil War. And they don't know what the hell they're talking about when they say Civil War. What Civil War? What are you talking about? Obviously, we're not confronting a situation that's akin to what Lincoln faced. With two distinct bodies, confronting each other. But I know that the security apparatus in this country, FBI and so forth, is concerned about lone actors doing awful things to further destabilize things. Look at this kid, with an AR-15 who somehow managed to get on a roof in Pennsylvania and take a shot at the president, the former president.
It's the Mark Twain quote, right? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes at times.
Yeah. Well, it's attributed to many people, but that's the quote.
Is it one of those things that we give Twain credit for that we're not sure whether it was him?
Yeah, I've heard it attributed to Churchill.
He's another one who gets a lot of credit for quotes.
Oh yeah.
Did anything come out of this book that inspires the next book?
No.
So we're leaving the Civil War alone at this point.
We are leaving the Civil War alone at this point. I have no intention of writing about the Civil War ever again.
You've added your tomb to the 66,000 Civil War books.
Yes.
I understand you've moved. Is your next book about you mentioned the Gilded Age?
It is set in the Gilded Age.
And that's all we'll reveal at this point.
That's absolutely all.
Erik Larson, appreciate you joining us for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.